Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us today for the Lytham Partners Summer 2021 Investor Conference. My name is Joe Dorame, Managing Partner of Lytham Partners. Up next, we have our MedTech panel presentation. Our panelists are Michael Klein, Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of ICAD Inc., and Jeremy Sobotta, Chief Executive Officer of Perimeter Medical Imaging AI Inc. For today's event, I have asked Brooks O'Neill of Lake Street Capital Markets to act as our moderator. It is my pleasure to introduce Brooks O'Neill. Brooks is a senior research analyst bringing 30 years of capital market experience and covers the healthcare space for Lake Street Capital Markets. Brooks has built a career on identifying high potential healthcare service companies and also medical device companies. Before we begin, Lytham Partners is one of the country's leading investor relations firm with more than 2 decades of experience. We have built one of the industry's most diverse and effective platforms for connecting small cap companies with high quality institutional investors. Hopefully, today's event is another example of how we can add value. With that, let me turn the floor over to Brooks, and thank you for leading today's discussion.
Joe, thanks an awful lot, and thank you all for joining us for our conversation about innovations in breast cancer detection, surgery, and treatment. We're really pleased to have Mike Klein and Jeremy Sobotta join us for this conversation. I think you will find their innovations to be significant and likely to lead to really positive things for their companies. Before we begin the conversation, perhaps Mike and Jeremy, you could each briefly introduce yourself and your companies. Mike?
Yes, hi. Thank you for inviting me and Jeremy to speak today. Mike Klein, Chairman, CEO, ICAD Medical. ICAD is a company that is involved primarily in women's health, primarily in breast cancer. We have 2 core parts of the business. One is artificial intelligence that we use to detect cancers. And help examine the hundreds of images now generated through mammography. The other side of our business is on the therapy side and uses intraoperative radiation therapy to deliver radiation that could be delivered over 6 to 8 weeks, but we deliver it in about 10 minutes during the process of a woman having surgery to remove a lumpectomy. Those are the 2 sides of ICAD, and welcome the opportunity to talk about these today.
Jeremy?
Great, thanks, Brooks, and yeah, thanks to Lytham and everybody for having us here today as well. We're thrilled to share our story with you all. And so, Jeremy Sobotta, Chief Executive Officer of Perimeter Medical Imaging AI, and we are bringing novel imaging equipment to help transform cancer surgery with a significant focus on women's health, as Mike alluded to. But what we do is we provide ultra high resolution and real-time advanced imaging tools to help surgeons evaluate specimens that have been removed from the patient to ensure that they've achieved what's called clear margins, thus, ensuring that they've removed all the cancer from the patient. And we're commercializing our existing technology today, and our next generation, which we're in clinical validation phase on, is to add artificial intelligence to that technology to really accelerate user adoption and ensure maximum efficiency and accuracy in those reviews.
Great. Welcome, guys. We really appreciate your willingness to talk to us today about this key topic. I wanted to get started, perhaps, Mike, by asking you if you could help us frame the size and magnitude of the problem. Is breast cancer a significant issue globally today? And if so, how do you think about just the size of the problem we're trying to address here?
Yes, thank you for the question. In the US alone, we're looking at 250,000 breast cancer cases each year, which accounts for, if you look at the volume of women who will live to at least the age 70, 1 out of 8 women will develop breast cancer in their lifetime. And that's a stunning number when you think about the average person easily knows more than 80 women over 40, even more over 30, which is actually a time when people are being diagnosed as well. and at least 10 of those people will develop cancer. So it's a very significant disease. It is literally like having a pandemic every year, forever, for the last number of years we've been counting. It accounts for 1 out of 3 cancers that women get, and it has just moved into the lead as the number 1 cause of death for women between the ages of 40 and 70. So it's a very significant disease, and 85% of women will have no family history. So without screening, which can significantly make a difference, we're stuck without, almost like a pandemic without having a test. And the numbers are significant, and as we've made a lot of progress, the percentage numbers are going down, but as you can see, we still have a long way to go to deal with this disease from both a diagnostic and treatment perspective.
Absolutely. That's great. I'm going to ask you another question about this area, because my sense is that with the advancements in mammography in the 60s and 70s, we ended up detecting more cancers, but there's still, I think, significant issues with mammography in today's world that I think you guys seek to address, which I'd like you to just talk a little bit about developments in mammography and then the problems that exist that you think you can address with your innovations.
Yeah, well, one of the great things is as technology has advanced, mammography has moved from film-based mammography to digital, which makes it easier to go back and look at the prior year's images to see change and to be able to track down where that image is in the first place. And when we moved from film to digital, there were 4 images that were film and 4 images that now became digital. And it was definitely helpful to have the storage and transportation of those images. Recently, and by recently, I mean in the last 5 years, a new form of detection has come out called tomosynthesis, which is basically dividing up those 4 images into hundreds of images. So instead of 4 images, we have hundreds, as many as 300 to 400 1-millimeter slices, which is great in terms of being able to find the smallest of cancers. But now you've got the challenge of finding a needle in a haystack. You've got now 300 to 400 images, the same amount of time that the doctors may need to spend finding the cancer, which in most cases is between a minute and a minute and a half, 80 to 100 cases a day. And now you're looking for hundreds of images. And although the images are better, we have the human factor to deal with, which is trying to find literally a needle in a haystack. So that's the challenge we're facing now with the advance of technology for this disease.
Great. That's very helpful. And maybe you could just talk a little bit about how disruptive the pandemic has been in the last year. Obviously, recommendation is that women get screened, I guess, every 2 years now, but with the pandemic, screening was really put on hold for many women.
Yeah, well, we screen in the US 40 million women a year. You could add 30 million to that in Europe. Just going back to the US, out of the 40 million women that would have been screened from mid-March of last year to mid-March of this year, the estimates are somewhere between 12 and 15 million women did not get screened. So we screened perhaps as few as 25 million women when we were supposed to screen 40 million women. And now that all screening centers are open, and actually have been for a while, we're only screening 2 to 3 patients an hour because of social distancing versus 4 to 5 per hour. So we're not catching up. So instead of having women be screened every year, which is the optimal time to find these cancers early, we've kind of got we've got an average now of like 16 to 18 months lag time, and we're not catching up. We're falling further behind. Sites are trying to extend their hours to accommodate, but the pandemic has really put a crimp in the cadence used for cancer detection, and has forced us to now focus on a different way of bringing back patients, and that is using risk factors as the basis for bringing back to triage who should come back first, because there's no way we're going to get everybody back into the system quickly unless we start looking at other factors such as personal risk, genomic risk, radiomic risk. That's the challenge we're dealing with right now.
Great. Before we turn to Jeremy and talk a little bit about cancer surgery and ways that Jeremy's company's innovation can really improve the game, Mike, I hope you might talk a little bit about both Profound AI and Profound Risk and how they might help us address both the need to have better diagnosis and the assessment of risk in identifying patients early for treatment.
Yeah, what Profound AI is a product that detects whether a cancer exists today. And, I often use the metaphor simply because it's easy for people to grasp that trying to find a cancer in these 300 to 400 images is like trying to find the ketchup bottle in the refrigerator, in a cluttered refrigerator, except we used to have only one, or with 2D digital, 4 refrigerator doors to open. Now you have to open up 400 refrigerator doors, and you have to do that in the same amount of time. So what Profound AI does is compares all of those images, all those foreign images, to millions of other sets of images that a particular woman have, and now is beginning to compare you to women similar to yourself to see if what is picked up based on a comparison, pattern recognition to existing images with the knowledge of which ones of those images were cancerous and which ones were normal. Does it meet the pattern? And we're now accurate in the mid 90% range in terms of being able to call which ones are cancer. In terms of the risk product, what we're doing is different than detection. We're trying to find the ketchup bottle that isn't yet visible, which means that we detect things with the algorithms and we go back 2 to 3 years and see it grow. We detect things that are still subvisual for the clinician. They're not yet entering the visual field, but we know from 8 to 10 years of tracking these patients that when they have certain characteristics, that they will, to a 80 to 90% likelihood, show up in the visual field in 1 year and with certainty in 2 years. And the risk assessment product allows a physician to not only see what's there today, but in many cases see what they cannot see with their eyes, but they can see algorithmically the probability of there being a cancer that'll be visible within the next 12 to 24 months. And the last thing I'll say about this is that we always thought this was going to be a product for the future going forward. But during the pandemic, when all these women couldn't come in, this product became a very hot product for us because people said, well, if I can't see these patients and I know I've got, let's say, 3,000 that I need to see in the next 90 days, let me run them all through last year's images, through the software, the Profound Risk Assessment software, to see what I could have known a year ago or 2 years ago, and then use those risk scores to determine who to bring back first, who to bring back in July, who to bring back in August and September. In a lot of ways, the pandemic has allowed the risk assessment and looking forward, almost predictive technology, to move forward at 3 to 4 times the speed that it would have happened naturally because of the pandemic.
It's great. So let's shift gears just a little bit. Now we've identified a patient with significant risk or actual breast cancer. My sense is there's a variety of treatments in today's world that include chemotherapy, surgery, and ultimately radiation therapy. Jeremy, why don't you talk a little bit about the surgery and followed by radiation and what the state of the art is today and how perhaps Perimeter can change that for the better?
Yeah, certainly. Thanks, Brooks. Yeah, so as you move along the continuum of care and the patient's care path, the couple emerging trends in treatment are really a significantly more participative, approach to just on what surgical intervention is right for the patient. And in addition to the impact of COVID impacting screenings, it's also delayed surgical procedures for a lot of patients as well. So one of the emerging trends we're seeing is an increase in the use of neoadjuvant therapy, whether that's chemotherapy or endocrine therapy, to try to limit any progression of the disease, or in best case scenario, reduce the stage of the cancer through that treatment, to really ensure that you can make an informed decision on the surgical path. And really the two surgical paths are breast conservation surgery or lumpectomies or mastectomies. And you know, the data shows that the results of surgical intervention are really strong. You know, the 5-year survivorship for lumpectomy with follow-on radiation is over 95%. So we get great results. The innovation we need is to improve quality of survivorship. And what you're seeing is, as patients are interacting more and being more participative in the decision making, you have kind of two trends emerging. There's a trend where more lumpectomies are happening. Patients want to conserve as much healthy tissue as possible. They want the best cosmetic outcomes and sensation possible, which a lumpectomy enables. And then there's another school of thought, which is kind of the go flat movement, which is you know, more straight to radical mastectomy and prophylactic mastectomies, depending on the genetic situation and whether or not that patient wants peace of mind. And one of the challenges that, or one of the factors of making that decision for your peace of mind, is today, with the tools available to surgeons, it's extremely difficult for them in a lumpectomy procedure to determine that margin assessment that we talked about earlier. So what the surgeon is trying to achieve is a 2 millimeter cancer-free barrier of you know, tissue that ensures, really the fundamental thought is that it ensures that they haven't cut through cancer and left cancer behind. And unfortunately today, with the tools we have, like I said, we have about a 25% reoperation rate in lumpectomies, because positive margins are found after the operation in pathology. And put yourself in a patient's shoes. If you tell me that I have a 25% chance of having to come back for another operation because the surgeon's not sure they've removed all the cancer, I'm much more inclined to make sure they get it all and be part of this go flat movement. And that's where Perimeter's technology is really coming into play. So what we do is we bring microscopic level resolution into the operating room so that the surgeon immediately can scan that specimen they've removed and determine whether or not they've achieved that 2 millimeter cancer-free barrier of tissue. And this gives the patient a lot more peace of mind, obviously gives the surgeon better outcomes, and really avoids the $16,000 in additional costs of treatment for patients that have to come back. So a significant game changer supporting the use of lumpectomy. And I guess what you know, one follow on is the overarching, you know, undeniable fact is that early detection saves lives. So everything that ICAD is doing to help these radiologists detect cancer earlier, it's really becoming an enabler for patients to have an earlier diagnosis, less invasive cancer, more likely to get a lumpectomy. And those less invasive cancers are really where Perimeter's technology shines. So if you think about the progression, you know, you move from you know, atypical ductal hyperplasia into a very localized type of cancer called DCIS. And the tools that surgeons are using today to assess those margins are effectively, the primary one is palpation. So they're trying to feel microscopic disease, which is very difficult to do. And then the next leap in the spectrum is that tomosynthesis that Mike talked about. But what that lacks is the microscopic level resolution to, you know, visualize that disease, that like ductal carcinoma in situ. We're really excited about where we're at with the technology. We just announced our upgraded 510K clearance on that device and are looking to get those out in the field in the hands of physicians impacted in the very near future.
Cool. All of that sounds interesting. One of the things that I'm particularly excited about that you guys are working on, sort of both of you, is the AI, the use of AI. And you know, my own view is AI in these applications is not going to replace either the radiologist or the laboratory professionals, it's going to make their work better. Maybe you could talk just a little bit about how AI will improve your solution, Jeremy.
Yeah, definitely. It's a lot like Mike was describing with ICAD. So you have a surgeon reviewing very detailed information with large volumes of thumbnails. And what we effectively do is provide a look here kind of solution. So we overlay those images, highlight areas that are suspicious for being breast cancer in the margin, so that the surgeon, is consuming operating room time, which is, very expensive. So the surgeon can quickly focus on the parts of the image that they're looking at. And to maybe follow on to the ketchup bottle analogy, some ketchup bottles in our use case look very similar to mustard bottles, which they would not want to take action on. So the AI is a great enabler to help them ensure they're looking at just the ketchup bottles that they care about, and they can quickly take action. And maybe to use a different analogy, the way I describe it for folks is we are a new imaging modality. We're a lot like ultrasound. So surgeons that use a lot of ultrasound are very familiar with interpreting our kinds of images. But having that AI really accelerates the user adoption path because it provides an assist for surgeons to quickly understand interpreting the images. So if you think back to when MRI was first released, if AI was as predominant as it is today, think of how much more quickly AI would be, or MRI would have been adopted, and how much stickier that relationship is after adoption.
Absolutely, that's really interesting. So now let's just shift gears to the back end of the treatment. My sense is that once we've identified a woman with breast cancer, once we make the decision to surgically intervene, which is a key part of the treatment, once we've assessed the margin to identify that the surgeon got all of the cancer, we still have one more step in the traditional progression of treatment for these women, which is, in today's world, 7 weeks of daily radiation treatment. In my mind, I mean, the beauty of that approach is that there's a high likelihood we've gotten all the cancer by the end, but it's, in a post-pandemic world, we know that asking a cancer patient to show up seven weeks in a row is onerous, and just the treatment is onerous. So Mike, my sense is Xoft could offer an amazing alternative to that 7 weeks of daily radiation. Why don't you talk a little bit about what Xoft is and where you are in terms of its evolution into more standard practice in the treatment of women with breast cancer?
Well, you hit on a good point. The length of this process and the misery associated with going through all this is actually one of the factors that prevents women from even wanting to get mammograms. In some ways, the mantra for a lot of women is the misery of uncertainty is worse than the certainty of misery. So can't you make this a simpler, quicker process? So that starts with what we've called our discovery to recovery process. The discovery of disease in day one, and the actual ability to go into biopsy at the end of that first day or day two, and then go into lumpectomy and then receive literally 10 minutes of radiation that's equivalent to 6 to 8 weeks of external beam radiation therapy. Now, that was a dream, many years ago, that we would achieve this 48 to 72 hour discovery to recovery instead of what can be 3 to 4 months from the time you're first screened to come back to get your diagnosis, to your biopsy, to your surgery, and then radiation. But this is now becoming a reality. And the product here really is certainty. If you've got a challenge, we're going to deal with it. You may be playing tennis with your lady friends on Sunday and Mahjong on Friday night, but in between you are diagnosed and treated. What we do after the diagnostic, the detection, I should say, on the AI side, on the therapy side, is put a balloon into the breast after surgery. That allows us to deliver. Now, you shouldn't say after surgery, at the same time as surgery. We're only as good, however, in doing that real-time IORT, intraoperative radiation therapy, as the surgeon's ability to know about exactly what Jeremy said, the margins. So what a lot of the doctors do is they just take a more amount of tissue than they would normally take. And this is supposed to be breast conserving therapy. They take more tissue to attempt to accommodate for that, to prevent this 25% recall rate. So what Jeremy does at Perimeter with real-time definitive margin read allows us to be able to do real-time intraoperative radiation therapy and accomplish in 10 minutes during surgery what would take 7 weeks afterward, accomplished literally in 10 minutes. The patient wakes up, they're done. They can even have reconstructive surgery done at the same time. So now we're talking about screening to diagnosis, to biopsy, to surgery, to radiation therapy, to reconstruction in a 2 to 3 day period versus months. And actually what Perimeter does, this is going to sound like an advertisement, but it really is a key technology that allows us to be able to do intraoperative radiation therapy real time. So really, it's we were talking beforehand, the technology of Perimeter enables the growth of intraoperative radiation therapy. But all these tools are available today. They're FDA cleared and reimbursed. The biggest competition we have right now is awareness, letting people know these technologies exist.
Jeremy, did you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah, I was just going to pile on. I think, as I think about where capital has been allocated and where innovation has happened in breast cancer treatment over the last, couple of decades, I think it's extremely exciting how you can hear that these innovations are feeding each other and enabling each other really across the workflow. So there's a ton of good things happening, and this is a situation where the rising tide is clearly lifting all boats for sure.
Yeah, that's great. So two areas that almost always come up when we're thinking about small innovators going into, huge areas of opportunity are A, reimbursement, and B, competition. Would you each mind taking just a couple minutes to talk about how you feel about reimbursement today, and then, what you're seeing from a competitive standpoint? That'd be great.
Well, I'll jump in on the reimbursement front. There's been reimbursement for intraoperative radiation therapy for quite a few years. The challenge is with our reimbursement, you might say, calibration factors, is it's often tied to the number of fractions, to the number of treatments received. So there's almost a perverse incentive to have a longer treatment regimen of 6 to 8 weeks because you get paid more for patients coming back, both on the technical fee as well as on the physician fee. So it almost doesn't allow disruptive technologies to come in. However, this is in a process of changing. CMS has introduced a new set of calls called the Radiation Oncology Alternative Payment Methodology. And they have indicated that starting January 1st, 2020, in about 30% of the US, they're going to start this off as a trial and then expand it. In about 30% of the US, they're going to actually bring down the rates for external beam radiation therapy from what is on average above 20,000 to about 12,000. And now the difference between intraoperative radiation therapy at 8,000 and 12,000, and this is 8,000 for one treatment at 10 minutes versus 12,000 for multiple weeks, gives the technologies a fighting chance to compete now. So this concept is based on value of care versus volume of care and quality of care versus quantity of care. We still hope to actually get on equal footing before the final rule comes out. In other words, this 8,000 moving up to 12, so that economics will not be a factor. And the reason that CMS will consider that and is because from a clinical perspective, we now have 5 years data and up to 10 years data for some patients, but on average 5-year data that suggests that the outcomes are identical clinically. in terms of recurrence rates at 5 years, and even a lower incidence of side effects. Identical with a technology that only takes 10 minutes and 1 day, obviously, compared to 6 to 8 weeks. So the reimbursement is good, and we hope it will get even better.
Great. Jeremy, any comments on reimbursement?
Yeah, I'd just pile on there, and I think what we're doing, both ICAD and Perimeter, is really squarely in the zone of moving from that fee for service to a quality of care, outcome. So as more institutions and payer provider integration happens, and you're sharing the same bottom line, this get it, pay per episode of care is ripe for Perimeter's technology. So as I mentioned, you've got 1 in 4 patients coming back for a $16,000 cost, averaging out to about $4,000 per patient in our scenario. It doesn't take very many reoperations to avoid to break even in our technology. It'd be a reduction of 25%. You'd be breaking even. So the value proposition is huge. I mean, it's a $500 million problem for the healthcare system annually. So really, really big opportunity to go after. And then from our next gen with the artificial intelligence, we're really, to squarely in your opening, we were awarded breakthrough device designation for that version of our technology. So CMS has recognized that, the FDA is clearing these very innovative technologies to really get unmet needs solved for patients. But then there's this reimbursement hurdle that they need to overcome to actually have the technology adopted. So we're really excited about the Medicare coverage of innovative technology program that, if once live, would provide for instant reimbursement for 4 years for those technologies after the FDA clears it for marketing. So a big tailwind for us to get that technology out there, raise utilization, and demonstrate the utility for all the payers.
Fantastic. That's great. So let's talk just briefly competition. Again, my sense is, I might have told you guys this, I went to Astro a couple years ago, a zillion big companies there, a zillion big signs there, all of them touting AI in diagnostic imaging and radiation therapy. My sense is you guys are uniquely positioned in the real world in terms of actually having solutions that are approved and working today. But just talk a little bit about how you see the competitive landscape. Maybe, Jeremy, why don't we start with you, and then Mike, you could chip in too.
Yeah, that's very reminiscent of being at like the American Academy of Orthopedic Surgeons, where everybody is doing a robot. The same right. Story. So we're fortunate in that we're a trend that's doing very, very good things for patients. But I would agree where I do think we are quite a ways ahead of other technologies, and for us, we're not just an AI story. We are the OEM imaging manufacturer bringing novel imaging equipment, but we also have this software as a medical device story as well. So it's a pretty unique offering. And, I think for us, as I, described earlier, the differentiation in our imaging equipment is really what sets us leaps ahead of the any competitive type of technology that would be trying to solve this same problem. And this is where I close the loop again on things that ICAD are doing to detect cancers earlier. Treatment is happening earlier in the progression of the disease, which is squarely in our sweet spot. Whereas you may have other technologies that are good at identifying more invasive types of cancer, we are, our best use cases in these early stage cancers where the surgeon has the hardest time identifying those margins.
Absolutely. Mike?
Yeah, it is a little bit like the Wild West in AI. It's, it's almost like the days when people put blockchain or proteomics in their name and everybody, would jump to those stocks. So when we look at competition, we actually see right now that the biggest form of competition is the customers that are either underinformed, malinformed, or ill-informed. And that is almost by design for the folks who are really not doing what we call the work, but want to represent, let's say, a placeholder. So for 2.5 years, we've had this lead in being the AI company, the first AI company that's been used for 3D mammography, with now 1,200 installs, and we have 6,500 installs of our 2D system. We have yet to see a competitive system installed, other than a trial in the U.S., an install that's been paid for. So what we see as the solution for this challenge is to, in a field that doesn't have a lot of, you might say, standards or even use of terms, is defining for people the difference between big data, machine learning, deep learning, what sensitivity means, specificity, because there's anybody, even on those last two words, anybody can be an unbelievable radiologist and have very high specificity. You just call everything a cancer. You'll be 100% right, but you'll also be wrong 98% of the time.
Right.
So it really is about educating how to make an informed choice. And sunlight, e.g. education, will be the best disinfectant. And when we look at competition, the way we win, and we pretty much have an unchallenged lead at the moment, we do that by putting what we call the Genius Bar in the Apple Store. You have to create an ecosystem of education to have people make an informed decision. And the more you do that, the more you help people develop their own AI pattern recognition to find signal amidst the noise. When all that is held aside, there's a lot of people that may be in the space. We intend to continue moving on. We're on our third generation, moving to our fourth, moving to prediction, to keep moving forward while at the same time educating the market.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Go ahead,
maybe just to pile on to that, Brooks, I do want to give a shout out to the FDA on this front, because it's rare that we in industry are giving kudos to the regulatory bodies, but they have recognized exactly what Mike was just describing, and they're trying to get some standards out there, and they're working with industry in a very collaborative manner to really ensure that we can get this technology to market as early as possible, continue to innovate with it and make it better as we accumulate more data, but also that we're all doing it from a level playing field. So just want to add that piece.
Yeah, that's a great comment. We really appreciate that. Well, we're coming up on the last few minutes of our conversation. I really appreciate all the insights you offered. I wanted to kind of maybe close by allowing you to highlight any other innovations, any other directions you see. Jeremy, you started early on saying you thought using your technology and more broadly in cancer surgeries makes a ton of sense. I know Mike has applications for his technology in broader areas. Why don't you guys talk just a little bit about some of the hopes and dreams for the future, or some of the things you're working on that lead us into the future as we close out the discussion? Mike, why don't you start?
Well, one of the things I'll say that came up earlier in terms of what the relationship is between AI and the physician, I don't think it's AI will replace physicians. I think the dynamic will be physicians that use AI will likely replace physicians who don't. And that's because the changes happening with AI and in the industry are taking advantage of the same movement that happened in technology in the computer industry, where it was keyboards, it was form factor hardware that was a differentiator. Just like in imaging, it was how many slices you can make out of a CT scanner from 4 to 8 to 64 to 128. We're at an asymptotic point in the curve where there's only so much you can do with the hardware. At this point, all the differentiation is happening with what you can do with the data. We throw away 90% of the data that's generated. And there's more data that we haven't even incorporated. In addition to the imaging or radiomic data, there's genomic data, there's metabolic data. There's all this data that can be correlated and sequenced and actually mapped to risk factors. And as we look to the future of AI will be defined by being able to correlate these dynamics that have always been out there, but have been literally almost impossible to correlate and hold in a human brain and be able to look back at multiple years' images. All that can be made much smoother. And as Eric Topol says in his book, which is called The Patient Will See You Now, you'll see an inversion of medicine where the doctor's time will be spent more time with the patient, being a diagnostician, being somebody who could solve problems and actually working therapeutically with patients instead of behind the scenes trying to be a statistician and incorporate and calculate all these things. So it allowed the physicians to do what they do best and allow technology to do what it can do best. And the two are, forever connected. And that's back to the point of physicians who use AI will be in a better positions than who don't at all.
Absolutely. Jeremy?
Yeah, I echo everything Mike just said. And then, for us, I think we've got a couple of different paths of innovation. So what you described into other tissue types, the same margin assessment problem exists in other solid cancer surgeries. So we would definitely like to build on our AI foundation for breast cancer and start moving in those directions. But also, there's the ability to quickly acquire these microscopic level resolution images impacts other parts of the workflow. So in between the detection and the surgery, we have a biopsy that takes place. Biopsies, the targeted tissue is getting smaller and smaller as it's being detected earlier and earlier. So we believe we've got a lot of opportunity to help there, either in breast or in places like lung. And then downstream after the surgery, while pathology is the gold standard we're working with today, it's a sampling technique, and they're only looking at about 16% of the margins when they're evaluating it. So giving them something that can give them a gross pathological assessment at a microscopic level of detail in real time is a big win for them as well. So we believe, there's horizontal and other tissue types and vertical across the continuum of care for our technology.
That's great. That's great. Well, with that, I think we'd better wrap it up. Guys, I really appreciate your time and insights today. I think you both know that I am wildly excited about the future opportunities you guys are going after, both as companies and for the patients. It's a very, very exciting time. Joe, we want to thank you for making it possible for us to have this conversation today. Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.